At the Oscars the other night, Tyler Perry had some big speech. He won some humanitarian award, or he had some speech about like refusing hate. Like, I refuse hate. I just was thinking about just like that's, it's a recipe for like secretly hating one thing super intensely. Like to say that, I just don't hate. It's like, no, you do hate, and you need to be aware of what you hate, or you're going to hate it in some dark, nefarious ways, like we've been talking about. And it just felt like he was trying to launch his own like self-help brand or political bid.
Yeah.
So we'll see what comes out of it. But it was just like on this big stage, and everyone's saying like, oh, this is powerful speech. And there's supposed to be some big message of reconciliation. It's like, no, now I just want to know who he hates and what he does to them. That's all I got out of that speech.
It's interesting, isn't it? This idea that in the psychoanalytic school, the whole idea was that everyone has love and hate in them, and that ideally love and hate come together in this dialectic, and that the hate energy, the hate force, the hate impact on the psyche is absolutely necessary and vital. It's the discerning, differentiating aspect, right? Otherwise, there's no boundaries, there's no discernment, there's no evolution. And it's just this thing where we're actually specifically now even using the language that, no, we're going to erase hate.
Right.
Which is absolutely 180 degrees from the insights of the psychoanalytic school and or Nietzsche. But they're not even saying that. Like, it'd be one thing if it was like, we're going to counter that because I think that's wrong and here's why.
Right.
It's just as if it never even existed.
I'm going to rebrand repression. That's what I'm going to
do. Yeah. Yeah. Only they don't think it's repression. They think they're really going to get rid of it.
Right. They think it's transcendence.
I think they don't even think it's transcendence. I think they think they're going to root it out. Because I'm all for transcendence, but
they're going to redefine the foundation.
Yeah.
Well, but it's transcending without including. How about that?
But I think they're saying that they're not starting from the premise that the hate is just in there and exists. They're saying it's a social construct or a result of experience.
Okay. Okay.
And that if we do our work to eradicate it, future generations aren't even going to have it.
Got it.
Which I think's wrong. But it comes back to that whole idea of are there innate drives, instincts, impulses, or are there not?
Right. Well, it just makes me think about that randomly. I was reading some story about like this guy was a sperm donor, mm-hmm. and he had like later in life met a bunch of his, kids basically. He would host these like summer camps for them to come and like hang out and get to know each other.
Really?
And so, yeah, so like one of these, and so this story is being written by his nephew. So somebody like in his, direct family who would also go out to these camps. And he just said that it was like crazy that so many of these kids had like the same mannerisms as his uncle.
Right.
And like had the same, even aspects of their personality. And they had never met him prior to that. It's anecdotal, but it's still like, I think speaks to what an aspect of what you're talking about. There's stuff that just gets wired, and some of it's personality and some of it's like genetic, and some of it is more primal than that too.
Right.
So that's a different category of experience than what you're talking about, but I think it's related to the fact that there's just things that are wired regardless of what additional programming you receive.
Yeah, I agree. And we all know that breeding works, right? It has an effect.
Right.
And so, yes, how we treat each other now affects future generations. But then there's the question of what are we breeding for or towards? Because you can breed dogs, or horses to be racehorses, or you can breed them to be attack dogs, or you can breed them to be docile house pets. You can breed, there's that thing where French bulldogs have been bred to have their face more and more flat to where now your average bulldog can't breathe right, and they actually are quite unhealthy and suffer.
Right.
And there's a bunch of animal rights stuff about how it's actually it's become this sort of abusive breeding practice to do that because we think it's cute that they have such a smashed face.
Yeah.
But it makes for a quite unhealthy animal.
Yeah, you breathe with a smashed nose and see how it goes.
Yeah, right. But so it's that thing, Nietzsche was saying, look, we're starting to breed ourselves into being these like pathetic, docile, shame-filled weaklings, And he was like, I'm not sure that's like the direction to go.
Mm.
So again, whether you're just talking about raising a kid or whether you're talking about society as a whole moving forward through generations, trying to breed out hate, for example, is different than how do we confront, and consciously understand hate.
Right.
Which again is back to that thing, like if we just burn all the bad books and erase any memory of any atrocities or abuse, then they won't happen again. And it's like, no, it's actually works the other way around. So anyway, the whole like, oh, I reject hate, it's like on a certain level, in a certain context, that sentence makes sense.
Yeah, right.
But it's the fact that it's being painted with such a broad brush that becomes meaningless or worse.
It's just I'm trying to like feel out the consequences of that, right? Like, is it a shame-based society, like you're saying? Like, is it, or or like Nietzsche said, is it like do we then act out of avoiding shame rather than employing our full faculties? Because there's just I think you can feel the neutering effect of trying to think of not feeling hate at all.
Yeah.
Like there's some like that kind of split. It de-animates you in a way.
Yeah, it's castration.
You turn it inward, right? Like you're gonna hate something.
Well, yeah,
you could. It's like one option, like one.
Yeah, if you believe the idea of conservation of energy,
right?
Then the idea is that the hate's in there and it has to go somewhere. There's no getting rid of it, right? Conservation of energy is that you're not getting rid of anything.
Right.
And when you say, I reject hate, you're hating hate. Like it's just nonsense. It's like there's two kinds of people in the world. There's the dualists and the non-dualists, and I'm a non-dualist. And it's like, are you seeing what you did there? And that's a dialectic, right? The idea of dualism and non-dualism.
Right.
That's a dualism. But that's that weird, paradoxical, transcendent thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, is that what Tyler Perry is trying to say he's coming from? And it's like, maybe in idea, but I think it comes off as just preaching one side of a duality.
Right.
Which is, that conflict.
Just makes a new us versus them.
Right.
You just keep redrawing lines. And then I think people hear that in what you say too. Like it doesn't matter how unifying your words are. Like if your unconscious intention is to draw a new line in the sand, people are going to feel that and react to it.
Yeah.
Like if you're not actually encompassing the duality and non-duality of the issue in what you're saying, people are going to react to that.
Right.
No, I like how you put that. Hating hate struck a chord. You can feel that, It's like slapping your own wrist,
Yeah.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
Something that I was wondering about that we mentioned a couple weeks back, and I don't know if this is not the context we were talking about it, but I wonder if it was applicable, as you mentioned the idea of ideal blueprint, or what in our development and healing, consciousness is working towards. And so this seems like, I guess, I don't know if it's related, but that's something that came to mind while you were talking about hating hate.
So that idea, it's just an idea that I think's interesting, and certainly don't claim to have a deep understanding of it. But if you think of, like, what comes to mind for me, for example, if you have a seed, the seed of a tree, and it's like, okay, there's certain, you could lay out certain parameters or characteristics or things that would be healthy versus unhealthy tree, right? Like for an oak tree, it's like what makes for a real healthy oak tree versus not. And so there'd be kind of that ideal blueprint existent in that seed based on the environment. For example, does that tree get to grow into its full expression of what would be kind of its ideal structure, let's say, or does it not get enough water, not get enough light, or is there stuff in the way that, makes it get all bent out of shape or inhibited to grow in certain ways? But so there's this force kind of trying to happen that's working against either environmental forces that are encouraging its natural growth and or are inhibiting it, right?
Mm.
And it obviously gets super complex, because even like with wind, it's like, well, you wouldn't want zero wind, because the oak tree is going to be very, very weak, because the wind is actually what, stimulates the oak to get stronger. But you don't want so much wind that it breaks it, right? And so there's always kind of this zone that would be optimal. But so again, it's like, well, what is this blueprint? What is this thing existent in the seed that is this kind of force behind its development? And so just kind of that idea that if you go build a sandcastle, it's kind of like, well, it's the intelligence for building the sandcastle is sort of coming from without, right? It's not existent in the grains of sand. You're coming in with an idea and sort of building the sandcastle, which is different than if you put a seed in the ground, right? It's like there's some kind of innate intelligence that's happening,
right?
And it's like, well, what's the human being? Because I feel like more and more we're acting like the human being's like a grain of sand more than a seed. We think we just shape the human being completely via society. And it's like, wait, aren't there some inherent characteristics in the in the human that are not up to us, but it's up to us to either foster them and or inhibit them? So again, just my sense of the dimension approach is, let's say your wrist hurts, and whether you don't know why it hurts, or whether you broke it, it hurts ever since you broke it, or no matter what's going on, even if you got screws in it or whatever, it's like, I'm bringing my attention to your wrist and I'm holding a conscious space. When I hold a conscious space for your wrist, that conscious space that, again, isn't about me, it's just consciousness, when anyone holds a conscious space, that conscious space provides a perfect environment, if you will, for your wrist to be in. And when your wrist is given that environment, your wrist starts to move and change and grow and heal accordingly, according to its own perfect blueprint. So I'm not going in there and going, well, this tissue should let go, and the bones right here should do this, and the adhesions should come undone, and the ligaments should. I'm just holding this environment.
Right.
It's like if you have a plant, and you see it, and it's like, man, I think this plant needs some oxygen because it's in this environment where it's not getting any air, and it needs some sunlight, and and when you do that, then you sit back and you watch and you go, I think the plant's now I think it's gonna do better.
Right.
And that idea of conscious space versus not, it's like, is there air or is there not? And when you give it air, or when you give it space, or when you give it sunlight,
whatever it needs.
Yeah, and it's like that conscious space does it. It just see my experience is sit there and give it the space, hold the space, and then just wait.
Hmm.
And then the change that starts happening isn't because I'm intending a change. The change that starts happening is because again, it's more like a plant.
Right.
Where there's this innate intelligence that's happening. It's very different than if I'm sitting there, building a sandcastle or carving a piece of wood or something. That's a different kind of thing than when you're taking care of a plant. And I don't know how all that works, but my sense is disease, distortion, et cetera, is a result of there not being consciousness. Consciousness being perfect and imperfection being the result of unconsciousness.
What's the scope of diseases you think falls under that?
That's the thing. I don't know. I keep thinking that I'm going to start working more and more with more, cellular systemic types of diseases. So far, where my work has gone, obviously, has been more musculoskeletal, mental, emotional, imaginal.
Yeah.
And it keeps seeming like
even that CTE stuff you're talking about is related to that, more cellular than musculoskeletal anyway, and definitely not strictly mental emotional.
Yeah, right.
Then you're really gonna be in trouble, Lance, if you start saying people are gonna start looking for the chicken gizzards.
Yeah, but it also comes back to, in the same way that it's like I'm not trying to tell the person how to stand or how to move. I'm just helping them bring consciousness to their body. I'm not trying to tell them how to think. I'm trying to help them bring consciousness to their thought, which is different.
Yeah.
And of course, the nature of it is I have to do a bunch of talking about thoughts and interacting with their thoughts. And so it can seem like I'm trying to tell them how to think or, because there is a paradigms around this stuff. But the point is, let consciousness determine how you think.
I think it's interesting. Like what kind of came to mind immediately for me, because I hadn't heard you describe it that way, but I think working with you like on physical stuff, like I've never heard you say, this is how it should be. Like it's always just like, do you notice this in yourself? Do you notice this? All right, now notice this and see what changes. Like it's just an interesting, and as far as like how you approach that work, it's never been about like this is the correct form or this is the correct movement. It's just here's something you're not aware of.
Yeah, and I definitely have my ideas about what's correct movement in a very mechanical, structural way, but the client just starts trying to contrive that if I present it that way.
Right, and then they use whatever the status of their existing system is, they'll try to shape that to this form you've described instead of deconstructing the existing form.
Yeah.
Did you ever, was that a trial and error lesson there? Like, did you initially try to teach some form and be like, oh, I should just not do that?
Oh yeah, for years.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's a cool insight. And I think it is in line with how you describe consciousness work in general, or just the dimension approach in general. But I like the tying the concept of form to ideal blueprint, and that consciousness moves towards that. The given conscious space, the self moves towards that, regardless of an explanation of what the form is or what the form should be. I think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it really is that thing where it becomes spiritual. It's if you think you're your ego mind, and then you're thinking, well, I get to create my own meaning and create my own life and create my own beliefs and whatever. What I'm saying is counter to that.
Right.
And then what most people think is, well, then that takes away my freedom. And it's like, no, what it does is it what your identity is shifts. Mm-hmm. It's that whole thing that's so confusing. Your ego mind that's mad about not having autonomy or freedom isn't who you are. So when I'm saying your ego mind isn't autonomous, doesn't know what it's talking about, isn't making its own decisions, is just operating via programs, you don't have any freedom of thought. That seems like such an attack, but it's like if you were telling me that if you had a little Star Wars character that you're trying to tell me is you, and it's like I'm telling you, you're making that Star Wars character do stuff, or your teddy bear or your puppet or it's like that's not you. You're the thing making that thing do some stuff, but that thing has its limitations, and our ego mind is that,
right?
Which is a radical change. It's that whole thing where it decenters the ego mind within your own system. If your psyche is a solar system, your ego mind is not the frickin' sun.
Your ego mind's just like a spaceship, like right. Being like thrown around the solar system.
Yeah. It's not even a planet.
Yeah.
It's a
Oh, you were talking about like how your ego mind is like it's just doing stuff and you're controlling it, and it's not you, and it's also like it has limitations. And I was thinking about like it's just getting thrown around and like propping things up with duct tape and popsicle sticks, and then like just this old like beat up spaceship is just like what came to mind, and then like it's just trying to make its way through.
Yeah,
and it's like that's such a small part. Like if you think about the solar system, like an individual spaceship in that.
Yeah.
And the solar system is you. And it's just a good scale reference, I think, or that it's one tiny lens of perception that we imagine has to be tasked with the planets orbiting the sun.
Yeah.
Can't do it.
Can't do it. Cannot do it.
You'd be real anxious if you think it has to.
So to sit in that experience of your own ego mind being this out-of-date, defunct program, it feels shitty. But if you allow it, and you allow yourself to actually disidentify with it and let it be what it is, then you start to find, to go with that solar system analogy, you recognize, you not only weren't that object, you're the space, and you're actually the sun.
Right.
If the sun is the conscious self. But it requires that experience because right away when people even try to imagine that, they immediately try to have their ego mind be a sun. And it's like, no, it's not that your ego mind becomes a sun. Your ego mind doesn't wake up. It doesn't get enlightened.
I think that's where, like, your explanation of the difference in the way light emanates is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
As far as, like, if you imagine your ego mind being a sun, it's still a point.
Right.
It's still like, it's even just conceptually as you try to imagine it, it's a point. But that it's the truth of it, of conscious light, is it envelops. That there is a from without and from within aspect to it that can't be conceptualized as a point of light. That the dimensionality of it can't be restricted to that and understood properly or experienced, or really experienced. Just remember the way you were talking about it with the headlamp versus light in a room versus light from outside versus stars in the sky. Just all of those points are reference points for a light that's outside and within it.
And that experience of, if the ego mind is like the earth and the conscious mind is like the sun, the only reason the earth isn't just pitch black, and of course there's some starlight that hits the earth that's not. So there's that, right? But even when there's stars out, it's pretty damn dark here on Earth when the sun is, if there's no moonlight, right? If there's no moon, or if there's a cloud cover, whatever. If you think of your ego mind being that, the only reason there's any light being experienced by your ego mind, it's because of the conscious mind. The ego mind doesn't have any light of its own. The ego mind is dark, dark, dark. And the way we experience that is fucked up, evil, terrifying, lost, hopeless death. And when you separate consciousness from it, that's what you experience. And, for example, when you die and there is a separation between consciousness and your body, look what happens to your body pretty quickly when it's absent consciousness. So as you sit there, it's like, why is your mind not just in that kind of absolute darkness state? Well, it's because of your consciousness. That's why. And then the question is, well, how dark do you feel right now? How lost? How dead? How terrified? How evil? Well, it's just a direct relationship between, well, how in touch with consciousness are you right now? Right? What part of your ego are you orienting from, let's say, or anchoring in or identifying with? And then how much consciousness is in that part?
Right.
Because you're, just like which room in your house are you going to go into and how much light is getting into that room?
Yeah.
Because you can go into rooms where there's, the windows are wide open and there's sunlight making it really light in there, or you can go into rooms where it's pitch black.
Mm-hmm.
But that surrender to or, decentering of the ego mind, and to have the ego mind be riding shotgun, the ego mind's ideally is not leading. It's being illuminated by, and we only can see via consciousness. The ego mind is just unconscious reaction. And it's just a really different experience when you just allow that. It's like it puts you. The analogy I use a lot is horse and rider, and it's like, look, if you're sitting on a horse, you better be aware that horse has some ideas of its own. You can't just get on that horse and grab the reins and think you're going to do whatever the fuck you want to do with that horse, right?
Right.
Like there needs to be a relationship. Even if it's a car or a motorcycle, there's still a relationship. You got to understand what is going on with this vehicle, right? And again, it's the same above. It's like the mind needs to have that in relation to body, and ideally, the soul has that in relation to mind. In the same way that the horse is going to just act like a horse, and it's not going to do the stuff that it would do when a human is operating it, right?
Right.
So it's like, well, what does a horse act like in the wild that's never impacted by humans? And if you said, well, what's an ego going to act like if it's never impacted by consciousness? And, of course, the idea here is that actually horses have some consciousness, and, so it's been this, right, this developmental spectrum. So to just try to say a human with zero consciousness, it's, well, then the human's going to act lower on the, spectrum, even than than your lowest of life forms. But so you can't just say zero consciousness, right? But it's like as you start to go down, what you start to get is a ravenous beast. And what's worse is, because it's not just this evolutionary spectrum, it's like you have the human is a very sophisticated, the human ego is a very sophisticated, complex structure. And it's just if you have that complex of a structure without consciousness, you have a pretty diabolical life form. Which, gets into this idea about AI fears, right? Where if AI just has a certain, has certain programming, but isn't capable of consciousness, which means, which would involve compassion and, stuff like that. It's pretty damn scary, because the idea had been that the AI would just carry out these programs, and destroy the human race or destroy the earth. And there'd be no awareness around that.
I didn't know I had to worry. No.
Well, Elon Musk says that we have to worry.
Hate that guy. Oh no, I'm going to refuse hate. I'm going to eradicate hate. He's worried because he's going to tell us that he is one. You know, it's like I I am an artificial intelligence sent here to destroy you. That's going to be the end of that story. If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.
So I know I've asked this before, but that thing where I feel like the last half hour, as I'm talking about this stuff, it seems like I'm angry and sort of caustic and condescending.
Oh.
Is that how you're experiencing it?
No. There was a moment a while ago, I'm trying to remember what you were saying at the time, where I could feel that you were trying to explain something you felt I didn't understand. And I felt myself trying to show up and say, you know, like present as though I understand to whatever extent I do. And then I felt a shift in how you were talking about it. And I mean, I wish I could remember what it was. Well, we have video, so I could go back and check the tape. But there was like a darkness to your demeanor for a moment. And then I was like, oh, I better, you know, show that I'm paying attention. And then it shifted. But generally, no, I didn't think it felt angry or condescending or anything. But you
could feel my mind starting to say, hold space for me, motherfucker.
Could be, yeah. I don't know if I thought about it that way, but maybe that's a more encouraging take on it. The neediness of that is much more approachable than the dour, you know, just the you're a motherfucker instead.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's rarely phrased that way.
Right.